Diplomacy is the art and practice of conducting negotiations between representatives of states. In the diplomatic community, opportunities are plenty, but how many of them are at Zimbabwe's disposal? How far can we push the envelope? And do we have a seat at the table? More importantly, what is the world's perception of our country? Join me, Martha Mamombe, every Wednesday from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. as I give you diplomatic circles to unpack these and more issues. ZiFM Stereo, my station, your station. Z. Good evening and welcome to Diplomatic Circles, the show that discusses local matters with a global perspective. I'm your host, Martha Mamombe. Now, last year, the world was watching Zimbabwe closely as the country headed to historic polls. Now, a year later, what is being said and what is being done? With me in studio tonight is the U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Brian Nichols. Good evening, sir, and welcome to ZiFM Stereo.
Thank you very much, Martha. Good evening.
Thank you for coming. Now, let's get straight into it. This time around last year, Zimbabweans had cast their ballots, eagerly waiting to find out the next course that the country would take. Those were exciting times, right? Strange to think that it has only been a year since the elections. What would you say is the state of affairs in Zimbabwe right now?
Well, let's go back to that time. The wake of the election, people were ecstatic that it had been a peaceful ballot, that the election, while flawed in some ways, had been a marked improvement over previous ballots. And we saw Zimbabwe moving forward in a new and dramatic way to open itself to the world, increase private sector investment, and strengthen its democratic institutions. Horribly, in the wake of the election on August 1st, there was protests, violence, security forces shot 6 people dead and injured over 30. And in the years since, we've seen very limited progress in the political reforms which are necessary to underpin the very important economic reforms that are going on, and we've seen almost no progress in implementing the recommendations of the Motlanthe Commission, which included accountability and a national dialogue process and a healing process for Zimbabwe. I think the international community is still waiting to see the realization, the fulfillment of the promises that this government campaigned on.
Okay. Now, I'm glad that you mentioned the 6 civilians that were killed soon after the elections, because opposition supporters took to the streets that day saying that they were going to the streets because of election irregularities. Now, as you mentioned, a commission of inquiry was indeed set up, and it found that the use of firearms should have been the last resort. But do you believe that justice was served for those victims and their families, or was it just swept under the rug?
Well, we've seen, if you look at the recommendations of the commission with regard to accountability, there has been none. The police were to investigate and identify those responsible. If they've investigated, they haven't revealed the results of that investigation. The military was to take appropriate internal actions to hold people accountable. That hasn't happened. The report called for electoral reforms, which still have not happened. It called for dialogue between the political parties. While there has been the Paul ad, that dialogue has not included the leading opposition party. The reforms broadly that they've talked about in terms of policing, there's been some training assistance to the ZRP, but their ability to deal with protests without resort to excessive force remains in question. And just on the weekend past, we had the Deputy Minister of Defense say that the military would shoot people in the streets and they were trained to kill. So that kind of threat is extremely worrisome, and it's hard to see how the international community can view Zimbabwe as moving forward toward democracy when we're faced with those types of statements.
Right. And from what you're saying, it's a long to-do list, things that the government is expected to do. What are the timeframes? Because the government would argue that we have more pertinent issues to attend to. We're trying to fix the economy. We have serious work to do. So how long should they take to deliver on what the Commission had suggested should be done as recommendations, do you think?
Well, on December 18th, the president announced his acceptance of the recommendations of the Commission December 18th of last year. It's been, we're almost at August now, so we're talking about 8 months of waiting for any of the measures to be taken. The report called for the repeal of POSA, and a new legislation was introduced into Parliament, but was found by the Legal Affairs Committee to be unconstitutional.
Right.
So it's had to be withdrawn. And I think when you talk about time, certainly for the international community, our concern is that as these reforms are delayed, the people of Zimbabwe are suffering horribly. Let's look at the current circumstances. The ZES is not coming. There's half the city doesn't have water, and the half that does have water in the urban areas only has water a couple of days a week. When there's no electricity, your borehole doesn't work. There's no bread in the markets. The prices are beyond the reach of average people. There are so many challenges, and the underpinning of the economic reforms, and I can't stress this enough, is political reform. That's what will increase confidence and boost the economy. I've publicly stated before that I support the Transitional Stabilization Program. I think it's the right way to go, but it cannot work in isolation. It must be accompanied by profound political reforms.
Right. I'm glad that you mentioned electoral reforms, because according to a report by the International Republic Institute and the National Democratic Institute, the country's improvements have not been sufficient enough to establish what they say would be widespread confidence. The report also said that electoral reforms alone were not enough, but a change in behavior was necessary. How is this achieved? Because we know old habits die hard, and politicians in Africa do things their way. So how do you convince them to change the way they do things, behavior change?
Well, I think...
is it even possible?
If you look around the continent, there is change happening. There are governments that are moving aggressively to reform the politics and the economics. Obviously, Ethiopia stands out as an important example, but there are a number of others that are moving forward quite robustly in that regard. And I want to underscore that the promises that this government made in campaigning, in President Mnangagwa's inaugural address, in the TSP, all stressed the commitment to profound reforms. And what our concern is that the urgency of those reforms we've not yet seen. They need to energize the drafting effort within the Ministry of Justice to put forward new reforms. Frankly, when you look at the consultation process, for example, with the electoral reforms and what's been put forward, what the drafting process was and the consultation process was with the new media-related and freedom of speech legislation, what's been put forward after it went through cabinet is not what happened. It does not reflect what happened in the consultation process with the broader society. So clearly there's a political reticence to allow the profound reforms that are needed and that the society is agreeing upon when they have these conversations.
And mainstream media in Zimbabwe, Ambassador, it rarely strikes a balance, right? It's either extreme opposition or extreme pro-government, and activists have said there is need for more radio and TV stations to allow that balance to be reached. Last month, High Court Judge Joseph Mafusire ruled that the state media had acted irresponsibly during last year's election coverage. Do you see this changing in the next election, given the pace at which we deal with things?
It's essential that the media space open. There have been a number of pending applications for additional radio stations, regulations to open up community radio, requests for television licenses that are all pending and have been for at least 6 months. This has to change. The idea that you can have one over-air television station in a country this important and this big just does not stand the test of reason. People should be able to watch more than ZBC, and particularly in rural areas, people don't have access to a breadth of information. And I know that many media companies that are already present in this space, including the one that owns this station, are seeking more flexibility in those regulations, the ability to increase their presence. And I think that would benefit the people of Zimbabwe enormously, and would satisfy the recommendations of the 5 international and 1 domestic observer organizations that have filed reports and put forward their views in consultation with the ZEC.
Okay. Ambassador, dialogue among political parties has been seen as key to Zimbabwe's overall development. And the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission was responsible for bringing together political actors to map the way forward. And surprisingly, the main opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa, refused to attend earlier this year, the first dialogue, saying that electoral reforms were needed first. Basically, he had demands that he felt needed to be sorted out before he would even engage with the president. Was that not retrogressive, do you think?
I think the entirety of the polity of Zimbabwe, as well as broader civil society, the church, private sector groups, should come together for an inclusive dialogue. I think that dialogue needs to move forward urgently. I think that the discrepancies over how that dialogue was going to begin earlier this year, you will recall that the Zimbabwe Council of Churches had convoked one meeting, and then the president did not go to that meeting, but Nelson Chamisa did, and then there was another meeting convoked at State House, which Chamisa did not go to, but the president did, and some other opposition parties. And so there was there's a posturing on both sides, I think.
Right.
And at this point, the society, how much pain can the people of Zimbabwe bear? People are facing a situation where 60% of families can't afford to pay their school fees, where people are skipping 1 or 2 meals a day. Maybe you get a plate of salsa and moriwo and a cap full of cooking oil to eat, if you're lucky in many places. The unemployment rate is 90%. The fuel queues, the petrol queues that are plaguing the country. I don't want to just list the problems of Zimbabwe. I want to focus on the solutions, but we can't get to those solutions without a broad, inclusive national dialogue that includes all sectors of society.
And how is that going to be achieved when there's this cat and mouse game going on between the president and the main opposition leader? One attends one dialogue meeting, the other doesn't attend. It's like they're just avoiding each other.
I think that the international community is eager to help birth a true inclusive dialogue. I think that civil society organizations like the aforementioned Zimbabwe Council of Churches have put forward proposals. I know that there have been some informal discussions around the modalities of a dialogue, and I think it's vital that happen. I would encourage the government to take the first step in first assuring that there will be a respectful environment for dialogue, and I would hope that the opposition and civil society would be flexible and say, let's go into a room and talk, and without preconditions, and at some point everyone has to come together and focus on the good of the nation.
Mm-hmm. And would the United States be willing to mediate? I know South Africa's ambassador Mamombe did say that if push came to shove, South Africa would be prepared to mediate those talks. Would the US be willing to do the same?
Well, I think it's important that mediation take place within, or facilitation, take place within a context that all sides are comfortable with. And I think that African mediation is preferable to mediation by or facilitation by those outside of the continent. And obviously South Africa plays a very important role in the region. And Ambassador Mbete is a good friend and colleague, and I completely respect his views and comments, and I think he's quite wise. All of the parties need to figure out who they are comfortable with in terms of mediation and facilitation, and figure out how to move forward quickly toward that dialogue.
Okay. Ambassador Nichols, you recently met with the mayor of Harare, Herbert Gomba. What came out of that meeting as far as service delivery and improving the lives of Harare residents is concerned?
Well, we are very proud to be residents in Harare, and His Worship, Mayor Gomba, has been a great friend and colleague as we've built our new embassy and moved into that. We're providing support in a number of areas, technical assistance on water, sanitation, and health. We've put in inline chlorination systems in a number of areas where boreholes are providing water to the populace so that they can be free of the scourge of cholera or typhoid. We are providing health assistance, for example, in the newly inaugurated Toriro Clinic in Hopley. We provided the electronic patient records system for that clinic, and we're similarly interested in expanding that system to other clinics around the city. We are interested in making some improvements to the area around our embassy, which I think will make it more attractive and user-friendly. We get a lot of visitors, so we're happy to say that the government has authorized us to work with them on building some parking and other improvements for the visitors around the Westgate Bluff Hill area. We're providing scholarships and international exchanges for municipal or council employees, if you will, not just in Harare, but around the country, and we are supporting the decentralization efforts. The devolution process within Zimbabwe is also something that's constitutionally mandated, and we want to support that. And we're fully open to cooperation with councils around the country. Most of the people of Zimbabwe do live in urban areas in terms of population, and we want to make sure that we are providing assistance in both urban and rural areas.
Okay. Now, Ambassador, the city of Harare has said that it is committed to ensuring that Harare achieves a world-class city status by the year 2030. You've been to other countries before Zimbabwe, and I'm sure you can attest to the differences, maybe even similarities. Now, last week, President Emmerson Mnangagwa said something interesting while he was meeting with a Chinese delegation. He said that, I quote, Zimbabwe is 40 years behind China in terms of development. Let's just have a listen to what he said.
The administration is going through a raft of economic reforms, which the People's Republic of China undertook 40 years ago. In this task and vision which we are following, we are inspired by the perception and the vision by His Excellency President Xi Jinping on the Road and Belt Initiative, making Zimbabwe land-linked rather than land-locked. Therefore, my administration is enthusiastically participating in FOCAC, where the People's Republic of China is providing $60 billion to Africa for us to develop our respective economies to talk to the philosophy of the Road Belt Initiative.
40 years to catch up with China, the president's words. There would be need for continuity from one government to the other to achieve that. What steps do you think we can take to ensure that there is sustainable development and we can catch up to China, ambitious as it sounds?
Well, I think the first step is to improve the business environment, and I'm quite pleased that there seems to be a renewed emphasis on fighting corruption, which is a major impediment to investment. I think bringing the fiscal and monetary policies into line with global best practices and ensuring the rights of investors here is extremely important. I've talked to a number of American investors who are interested in infrastructure projects and energy projects in Zimbabwe. And their concern is that the environment here lacks transparency and that the issues of corruption make operations extremely difficult. The ability to repatriate their capital is also, and their profits is a major issue for investors here. Nonetheless, Zimbabwe has a number of blessings. Its geographic location is propitious for trade throughout southern and central Africa. It is a country that has an educated populace. It has a wealth of minerals. It has a boundless agricultural potential, which unfortunately has been squandered through bad policies, particularly the command agriculture policies, where we've seen the wasting of as much as $3 billion, according to Auditor General Mildred Cheery. So there are a number of impediments, but I think addressing those, and I think this government has certainly stated its firm commitment to address those challenges, can make a tremendous difference. The rankings of Zimbabwe on the Transparency International Perceptions of Corruption Index and the Ease of Doing Business Index, those are both near the bottom of the region, and focusing on the specific measures there will help enormously. The United States is number one in global competitiveness, and we believe that the model that we offer is the best model. And we've created the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which stands ready to support investments throughout the world, and including in Zimbabwe. And the Overseas Private Investment Corporation of the United States is looking at supporting a number of investments here in Zimbabwe as well. But again, the ability of investors to succeed here and Zimbabwe to attract investment and make up that gap, it depends on the pace of reforms here, and reforms depend not only on the economic measures, but on the political measures.
Okay, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because Mozambique has been the beneficiary of some $25 billion by a U.S. energy company, Anadarko. Are you saying that Mozambique has better policies than Zimbabwe? Because as far as rankings on the corruption index is concerned, we are much better than Mozambique.
Well, I think Mozambique has been moving to reform, and they've made important strides. I think that the ability to repatriate profits from Mozambique is something that makes extractive industries more attractive there. I think we're seeing, and this has been mentioned by the government, this isn't breaking news, that people in mining sectors have not been taking product out of the ground because they felt that it's more value to them in the future in the ground than in the current
than it
day
is right now.
Right now, because of the surrender requirements at RBZ. And I think changing that model from a effectively taxing people through the surrender of Forex rather than moving to what the vast majority of countries around the world do, which is you pay taxes and it's a straightforward, predictable process, and that it will assure companies in the extractive sector that they're able to plan, they're able to purchase capital goods, they're able to import those goods. Those are all the areas where you could see significant progress in the extractive sector, and that's one where within a few years you could see tremendous growth if the right policies are put in place.
Okay, so this has to do with the dysfunctional financial system in our country rather than the policies and corruption itself. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's an ecosystem. So you can't have economic progress without political reforms to increase confidence. When you look at the weakness of the Zimbabwe dollar or RTGS before it, a lot of that weakness is driven by a lack of confidence, and the lack of confidence arises from a slow pace of political reform.
All right, let's take a short break with the sounds of Bob Marley. This one's titled Zimbabwe. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this.
Diplomatic Circle.
I have striven to make a country that works for everyone.
I love all people, rich or poor. But in those particular positions, I just don't want a poor person. Does that make sense?
Yes, Honorable Speaker.
Race remains a potent and often divisive force in our society.
Every Wednesday.
All those who resigned from the NEC of the Women's League because they said they cannot be led by a criminal, they are here. I'm waiting for a signal on how we should treat them.
Where diplomacy takes a break.
Welcome back to Diplomatic Circles. I'm your host, Martha Mamombe, and with me in studio tonight is the U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Brian Nichols. Thank you once again for coming to the program.
So happy to be here, Martha. Thank you.
So let's continue with our discussion. The European Union launched a political dialogue with Zimbabwe after years of strained relations. This has been widely seen as a change in rhetoric from EU leaders who are typically known to be critical of Zimbabwe's government and politicians. Is the US likely to follow suit? And if not, why?
Well, the United States has already had a dialogue at a similar level as the European Union. The analogous official for the United States is our Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Tibor Nagy. Ambassador Nagy has met with President Mnangagwa twice. Last year in September on the margins of the UN General Assembly, and more recently last month in Maputo on the margins of the US-Africa Business Summit.
Okay. And is this an ongoing process, or was this he meets the president, he goes back, and there's no follow-up to whatever was discussed? What's the process like?
The meeting in New York in September, Ambassador Nagy said that the United States very much wishes to work with Zimbabwe and supports the reform agenda that the president has laid out. He said that he would like to see concrete signs of commitment to that reform agenda, specifically the repeal of POSA and AIPA.
Okay.
That was in September of last year. When they met in Maputo, Assistant Secretary Nagy said to the president, the last time we met, I asked for a concrete sign of your commitment to reform by repealing the most worrisome and repressive legislation, POSA and AIPA. That hasn't happened. President Mnangagwa
so there are conditions to this
again
dialogue.
committed to working toward that repeal and doing so in the coming months. Ambassador Nagy wishes to meet with President Mnangagwa again in New York in September, and he's going to ask him, have you repealed POSA and AIPA?
Okay. All right. The West, particularly the US, is often accused of policing smaller countries, especially on human rights abuses, not just in the African continent, but the world over. Meanwhile, your president's administration is denying immigrants the right to food and shelter for illegally coming into the US. What message do you think this is sending to the world?
Well, the United States, as the President Trump has said many times, faces a humanitarian national security crisis on our southern border. The United States has passed new legislation to provide increased resources to the border. We have a system of laws, and when there is a problem with the way that the government of the United States conducts itself, people can seek redress before the courts, and that has happened. But this is an issue where we're dealing with an unprecedented surge of migrants to our southern border, and the president and his administration are committed to dealing with that and addressing both the current phenomenon and the root causes of that migration. And I don't think there's ever been a president of the United States who's been more focused on dealing with this issue.
But in being focused, he has been labeled a racist. He has been accused of being insincere and just being a mean guy overall. What do you say to that?
Well, I reject that. I think, the president has said...
Are you saying that because he's your boss? Or do you actually think that you believe in what he stands for?
Well, both of those things are true. So the president has repeatedly committed to improving the lives of all Americans. He just met 2 days ago with African American pastors at the White House, including the niece of Martin Luther King. And he's committed to improving the lives of all Americans. And the unemployment rate in the United States among African Americans and Hispanics has never been lower than it is now. Economic growth has never been higher, or not since the Kennedy administration, I should state. So the idea that he's not committed to helping all Americans is wrong.
Okay. And are you a Democrat or a Republican?
I'm a career diplomat. I've been in the Foreign Service since 1989, and I've worked under both Republican and Democratic administrations.
Okay, now, Ambassador, African leaders often feel that there is selective application of universal rules of conduct by presidents. An African leader would be blasted for making inflammatory comments. But who's keeping Western leaders, particularly your president, in check when he says things that are just offensive?
Well, I think people voted for President Trump because he says what he thinks and he's plain spoken. And you don't see a duality between what he says and what he does. And we have a system of democracy in our country, and if you don't like what a democratically elected leader says or does, we have an election coming up next year, and you can vote to change the leadership of the United States, or your senator, or your representative in the House, or your state governor, or your mayor. That's what democracy means. That's the system of checks. We also have a robust free press in the United States. The freedom of expression is protected under the First Amendment of our Constitution. And members of the media do hold all of our leaders to account when they say something that's not true.
Okay, let's talk about some of the good that your country is doing in our country. The US recently donated an additional $4.7 million to victims of Cyclone Idai. Now, this comes on the back of allegations that $9 million meant to help the elderly in vulnerable communities was used for administrative purposes by the Ministry of Social Services. There have been reports that food aid was being distributed along partisan lines at community level. So how is the money going to be used, and who is in charge of that process?
Well, thank you very much. We've now donated approximately $8 million for Cyclone Idai relief. That's going primarily to the districts of Chimanimani and Chipinge. We work through the UN World Food Program, CARE, Goal International, World Vision, and other organizations.
And those are the implementing partners.
Those are our implementing partners. So the assistance that we provide does not go through the government of Zimbabwe. And we believe that the extensive checks and controls that we have on our assistance ensures that every last cent reaches its intended destination.
Okay. Now, the US is celebrating 230 years of diplomacy. The local embassy here described diplomats in a Twitter video as people who listen and learn. They also described as being influencers and persuaders. Based on what you've learned in your time in Zimbabwe about the African way of life and doing things, do you think that you're in a position to influence Zimbabwe's social, economic, or political discourse in any way?
Well, I would like to think so, and I've certainly learned a lot here. Last Friday, I went to Hope Masike's record release of Exorcism of a Spinster, and I learned a lot at that concert and had a great time. Well, I learned about the enormous talent of Zimbabweans as singers, dancers, storytellers, and I also learned about the pressures that women in Zimbabwe face. And the title of her album goes to this idea that women must marry, and that if you're, over 25 and unmarried, there must be something wrong with you.
Absolutely.
And promoting the equality of women in not just this society but around the world is a major priority for me. I'm a father of two daughters who are at university now, and I think that when I see all of the talented women in Zimbabwe, I think it's essential that this country provide an equality of opportunity for them. And working for the He for She initiative under UN Women has been one of my proudest accomplishments here. Getting out to the rural areas, seeing the culture of Zimbabwe. The United States has provided $475,000 to refurbish and improve the Great Zimbabwe Monument near Mashingo. And we are focused on helping the environment, protecting wildlife, giving the people of Zimbabwe better economic opportunities, particularly smallholders of farms. And when I get to talk to those people and hear about their experiences and the challenges that they face, it strengthens my commitment to working with the people of Zimbabwe and supporting this great country. It's such a beautiful country, and the people are so talented. They deserve the best.
Okay, so we can expect good things from you, Tonia.
I certainly hope so, and the United States is Zimbabwe's leading bilateral donor. We've provided over $3 billion in assistance to Zimbabwe since independence. In the course of the current year, we are providing over $300 million in assistance to Zimbabwe.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned women, because my last question to you was going to be, Zimbabwe has been described as a beautiful woman that no one wants to marry because marriage is meant to last a lifetime. And let's face it, who wants to be tied down to a high-maintenance woman? So chances are she's not worth the trouble. It's an interesting analogy, but do you think it's true to Zimbabwe?
Well, first I have to say, I think that's a horrible analogy. I think this is... Zimbabwe is a country that has tremendous potential, tremendous talent, tremendous beauty. I think the people of Zimbabwe, when you look at the diaspora of Zimbabwe, let's look at the CEOs, the important executives, international civil servants, talented athletes and artists. Just on Sunday, I was at Moffat Takadiwa's Art Center in Mbare. Maybe not all of your listeners know about Moffat, but he is an incredible artist that is doing shows around the world. He's going off to Los Angeles next week, I think, to do a show there. And this is a country. I've never been in a place that has so many talented people. This is not a giant country. There's about 15 or 16 million people here. We'll find out when the census is next done. But those talented people deserve a country where their rights are respected, where they have opportunities to succeed at home. I shouldn't meet as many Zimbabweans in Cape Town as I meet in Harare. They should be here making things better. Absolutely. In Zimbabwe. You go to London, aka Harare North. You find all these incredibly talented people, and let's make this a country where they want to come back here and make their contributions in Zimbabwe. And transform this nation into the economic, cultural, political powerhouse that it should be. During the break, during Bob Marley's song Zimbabwe, I mentioned to you that let's remember when he was here giving this concert, Zimbabwe was the second richest country on the continent.
It was.
And 37 years later, it's certainly not, and it has the tools that it needs to succeed and to again reach that status. But the reforms need to start now. They need to progress aggressively. The anti-corruption push needs to continue. Accountability for the violence of August 1 and January of this year needs to happen now. No one has been put to book for the killings that took place. That needs to happen. POSA and IEPA need to be repealed. The government needs to take those actions urgently. We need to stop the bleeding and move forward so this country can realize its full potential.
I think improved relations between Zimbabwe and the US will see improved trade and cooperation as well as investment. But for that to happen, there's obviously need for dialogue. So in true Zimbabwean fashion, I would say, Ambassador Nichols, maitabasa nekuya, what would you say to that?
Tetenda. Makorokoto.
Makorokoto, that's congratulations.
I know. Congratulations to you for a great show.
Thank you so much for your time today, Ambassador Nichols. I hope to have you again on the show for a second part of this, hopefully, before the year ends. Thank you so much for coming, Ambassador Nichols. Well, that is all the time we had for today. I'm your host, Martha Mamombe. Join me again next Wednesday for another episode of Diplomatic Circles. Until then, good night. Stay safe.